Hey everyone, welcome to our webinar about impact careers in the private sector after your MBA. My name is Nell Debevoise. I'm the founder and CEO of Inspiring Capital and thrilled to be here with so many of you prospective fellows and also two of our alums, Alex Henkin and Joe Butcher, who are going to share their career path up to, during, and then after Inspiring Capital so that you can start to figure out how the fellowship might fit into your business school trajectory or not. That's good to figure out too. So I'm gonna ask Alex and Joe each to just share a little bit about your background before we do a grounding and move into some of the meat. So Alex, will you kick us off? Maybe tell us who you are and where you're at.
Sure, happy to. Alex Henkin. I am also in Cambridge, Mass right now, though normally in New York City in better times. So I work right now at Salesforce in an impact consulting, or not an impact consulting role, innovation consulting role that I've made into an impact consulting role on a team called Ignite. So we are a team started out of the CEO's office, out of a desire for Salesforce to be closer thought partners to our customers rather than just a tech vendor. So we lead them through design thinking engagements, usually around 12 weeks, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, intended to help them address a specific challenge in their digital transformation. My career path started in nonprofit. I was a fundraiser. I call myself a frustrated former fundraiser. I always felt like there were better ways of doing impact. And so Inspiring Capital was one of the big inflection points in my own career that helped me realize there were nonprofit ways of doing so and opportunities within the private sector specifically to still make impact. I came to the nonprofit side of Salesforce, salesforce.org, which at that time was a separate foundation first, spent about 7 months there in sales before realizing that sales was not a good fit, even though I was working with enterprise level nonprofits. And that's when I transitioned over to the dark side. So happy to share more about that later, but I will hand off to Joe.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And hi, everyone. Excited to meet all of you and share a little bit about my background and journey. So I am currently in healthcare and in pharma at Merck. I'm currently a director in our technology organization, and I'm leading an enterprise data and analytics program that's really driving the data transformation here at Merck. I've been at Merck now 4 years after finishing up at business school. So I went to business school at Wharton. And so going back before Merck and kind of before business school, I was actually in the military. So military background, I spent 6 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. So did the Marine Corps thing for a while, then decided to go to business school at Wharton. And like many of you, I went to school with this idea that I wanted to use business to have a positive impact, and got to business school with that very general idea and realized like, I don't really know exactly what that means, and found, Inspiring Capital to be a really great opportunity and program where I could explore a lot of different opportunities and options. So can talk more about that obviously in a little bit, but did some nonprofit consulting with working with a nonprofit in the city. And then coming out of the experience, I was really kind of attracted by pursuing private sector opportunities. I really thought a lot about the scale of private sector organizations and was kind of trying to think through what private sector companies and industries really resonated with my desire to have an impact. And that's how I kind of stumbled on healthcare. What was a bit ironic for me about healthcare and pharma is that, I came to pharma because of the impact that I feel like pharma companies have. And at the time, like it's changed a little bit with COVID, but at the time people are like, pharma companies, like big bad pharma is like making all this money and not helping people. But I found that, I know during the summer, we talked a little about this like gray zone of how do you kind of have a positive impact, but also run a profitable business. And I found that gray area within healthcare quite interesting. And now it's an exciting time to be within the industry, just given the race to try to find a vaccine and help us overcome the battles with COVID.
Yeah, brilliant. Awesome. Good. Well, now that you have a little bit of sense of who we're with, I'm going to ask us to do a quick pause. Mindfulness is one of the fundamental pieces that Inspiring Capital knows that research shows really robustly is critical to being well or productive, much less impactful and of service. And so we build in a lot of different elements of that through the summer to the fellowship, knowing that people come from a really wide range of backgrounds with mindfulness practice and self-care and all of that. And so you're in good company no matter where you stand. And if this feels a little bit uncomfortable, know that there is plenty about the fellowship that is a little uncomfortable, because growth requires discomfort, in our opinion. So we're not here to shield you from the struggle. We're just here to support you along the way through your summer, through business school, and long after, as you can see from these guys' relationships with us. So with that disclaimer, get your feet solidly on the floor, do a little shake or wiggle or whatever you need. It's been an intense year. You might have noticed it's been an intense few weeks, and first year of business school is intense even under the best of times. So shake that out, feel your feet on the ground, feel the earth somewhere under them. And if you're comfortable, I swear we're not taking any pictures or anything creepy. Close your eyes. Maybe put a hand on your belly to remind yourself to breathe all the way in. Our brains do not function without oxygen. And just take a few deep breaths. Perhaps the first that you've taken in many hours or even all day. And once you've landed, I want you to picture some element of next summer. There are probably a lot of options swirling. There's a lot of shoulds. There's a lot of coulds. And so just zero in on one element. It could be a color or a word or a person or a company name or a geography or a real life in 3 dimensions meeting, not just Zoom. But think about some element that you want your summer to have. Just one, super simple. You might have a bunch of things scrolling through your mind right now. Could be Google, could be Facebook, could be Girl Scouts, could be my own company, could be New York, could be on Zoom, could be working remote. So let that scroll fly for a minute. And now pick one element. Again, it could just be a word. It could be fun. It could be challenging. It could be just bright orange of learning. But pick one element and settle with it and hold it in your mind. And keep breathing deeply with that image in mind. Finally, before we come back and dive in, I just want you to say to yourself, I have everything I need to get the summer I want. I have everything I need to get the summer I want. And with one more deep breath, you can come back. Cool. I never know when I open my eyes if everyone's going to have signed off. So congratulations,
Okay.
You made it past the first hurdle. What, Alex?
I said we're all still here.
We're all still here. 100%. I like it. Cool. So now that we're a little more oxygenated, hopefully have some kind of tidbit of what the summer could look like, we're going to dive in and hear more from these folks. So we got to hear a bit about the path. Obviously, feel free to add other elements of that, or guys, if you want to ask questions, feel free. But my first question is, Joe, maybe we'll start with you, coming from a military background, that kind of public sector service-minded, being at Wharton, which, like most of these schools, is obviously primarily focused on for-profit work. Did you know when you signed up for school and or for Inspiring Capital that you were really private sector focused? You mentioned a little confusion, but how much was that confusion, and how did you see the private sector as an option?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was drawn obviously to the social impact space, but it was really hard for me to understand kind of what what are the different paths I could take within the social impact space, and how do I kind of make sense of what path makes sense for me? And that's where I think when I was looking at different summer opportunities, why Inspiring Capital really stood out, in that I could be part of a program and be around people that were also trying to kind of make sense of that and figure that out. And during the summer, obviously, I mentioned I did some nonprofit consulting, so I got a little more up to speed on what the nonprofit space was like. But also through working with my fellows, I got a sense of kind of what are the other paths I could take within the social impact space. And by being exposed to a lot of different speakers throughout the summer, I got a better sense of, okay, what are the different paths I could take? And given that I came from a military background and kind of new to the business world, I felt like the private sector path, at least initially coming out of school, provided me an opportunity to really grow as a business leader. And I was also, as I interacted more with private sector organizations and kind of understood how they were trying to leverage their resources and their scale to have a positive impact, I was excited to kind of pursue that path, at least initially, to try to really grow and develop as a business leader, and to kind of take advantage of the resources and scale that private sector companies have. But I will say that going back to kind of transitioning from the Marine Corps into business school, like I'm sure many of you are sitting there being like, what should I do? How do I make sense of all these opportunities, and kind of like what makes sense for me? I guess I would just say like that is totally okay and totally normal for you to feel that way. Like I definitely felt confused quite a bit as I was trying to kind of navigate my way. And even now, like I feel really happy with where I am now, but I also spend a good amount of time thinking about kind of how do I still navigate a career where I can still be successful, but also have the impact that I want to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Spoiler alert, you don't just figure it out and land and settle for the rest of your life. This is ideally, it's a journey. And a friend, actually a colleague, did her PhD research on whether private sector or public sector leaders are rated better as better leaders, right? On all the academic frames or metrics that leaders are rated. And the result, much to our pleasure and not so surprisingly in retrospect, is that the best leaders have spent time in both and have cycled back from the private sector to the public sector and the not-for-profit sector, right? And have some sense of both of those masters, if you will, right? Of profit above all else, arguably, and then purpose or impact above all else. So you're doing the right thing. And Alex, a real flipper, you were sort of, not-for-profit in your frustrated fundraiser role, came to IC as a very for-purpose, for-profit, went to the not-for-profit of Salesforce, and now at the .com. So tell us a bit about that journey and those plans, if there was one.
Yeah. If you had asked me in my early career, I think I would have told you that it was selling my soul to go to any corporation of any kind. And I think I've made a total 180 on that. So first of all, Inspiring Capital helped me understand all the different kinds of impact and all the nuances there within. And then it was actually Nell that encouraged me to look at Salesforce, because I had been mostly in nonprofit and startups for most of my career, and felt like it's great that we're figuring it out and making things up and making it work, but that there are places that have infrastructure, and large corporations abound with infrastructure. So coming to Salesforce, I had infrastructure in spades. I came to Salesforce specifically because their foundation model at that time, Salesforce.org, which sold to nonprofits, was actually a separate foundation, as I mentioned, a self-sustaining social enterprise. I felt like that was the best version of CSR that I had ever seen, because it was purpose-driven, but actually generating revenue for the company, and in doing so, furnishing nonprofits with technology to help them build capacity. It actually is now part of .com. So Salesforce absorbed .org into .com. So it would have all been part of the same company anyway. But the interesting experience for me at .org was that, unlike Inspiring Capital, we didn't really select clients very closely other than their tax status. So they were working with C3s, which are nonprofits, but excluding other really impactful B corporations or other IGOs, for example, that were doing really good work, but we're not necessarily an NGO or a nonprofit. And some of the enterprise level nonprofits that I was working with did not feel very impactful to me. Think of like every professional association. There's a lot of golf organizations that are nonprofit. There's some gray area in our tax status. And so I didn't feel the same level of impact at this supposedly foundation side of the company that I was hoping for, that I had felt working directly with clients at Inspiring Capital. And so for me, the transition to the private sector was more of a decision to go back to the kind of functional career that I was looking for, the same design thinking methodologies, the same consulting background, less about impact. But I've actually found much more impact on this side. And as I said, I've kind of sculpted this somehow into an impact role, because at a company like Salesforce and Merck and others that are really explicitly values driven, they are interested in doing good work, and that you can make a case for that pretty easily. So I've done a lot of pro bono work that has merged into my day job and not been classified otherwise. And we can talk more about that later on. But I've kind of fully shifted over to, this is my dream job in a lot of senses, because it has stability. It has stock, which doesn't hurt. It has a budget, which not all the nonprofits that I worked for had budget to do things. I see some nods. Other people are with me on that one. And I still get to do really interesting creative work at a level of influence that I don't think I would have gotten to do had I stayed in the nonprofit sector. So for me, it's been a really nice shift in that direction.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So I'm just going to insert an Inspiring Capital concept briefly that's not hard to wrap your head around, but I think important in terms of how we think about it and help you think about it for your careers. And that's the spectrum of impact, right? And so I spent the first 10 years of my career in the not-for-profit space in international development, specifically living all over the world, doing a variety of work, and just got really frustrated by the model with which we were funding that really important, really hard, really valuable work, but being funded kind of on a shoestring on a 365-day cycle where you couldn't have any strategy. Plus, it's a teeny portion of the US. It's 7% of US GDP. It's something similar of the global economy, and that's just not enough to make the scale of change that I believe we need right now. And so the framework that we use is the spectrum of impact, right? And the idea here is that every single organization out there can and should be having positive social environmental impact. It's different, right? Joe mentioned the scale of for-profits and big corporations. And so, when Walmart, for example, reduces the plastic on one of their packages by a gram, let's say, right? You're like, big whoop, Walmart, you're still using single-use plastic. If there's still 9 grams left, whatever, but that's 10 bajillion times 1 gram less because Walmart's scale is so massive, right? Which in some concrete way is more than, bless Greenpeace's heart, that is more concrete impact than they'll ever have. And hopefully one day Greenpeace or Nature Conservancy or whomever will rule out single-use plastic, or Walmart, because they'll realize that it's more expensive and it's causing all of this stranded waste, right? But in the meantime, it's not insignificant that they made that marginal change at the scale that they're at, right? And so our spectrum of impact just talks about the government, right? Whether it's the Marines, like Joe's background, or the national parks whom we work with, or any of the other many, many, many government agencies, local, state, or federal, or international that there are, that are purely to serve the people. Again, the execution of that is a whole other story that we'll talk about in another webinar, but the government is charged with serving the people purely. There is no profit motive there. Then you have the not-for-profit sector, which is now private, right? So there's a little bit more question, but still legally bound by the IRS to a very specific charitable mission, right? And not legally allowed to extract any profit. The social enterprise is the next part of the spectrum, and that is now what we consider to be for-profit, for-purpose. These are your certified B Corps, your Patagonias, right? These companies that are selling stuff have a very clear profit motive, but also committed to purpose, sometimes legally by their B Corp certification or benefit corporation status. And then finally, traditional for-profits, right? And here you have pharma companies that, and Salesforce that are values driven and are by no means perfect, right? And nobody's arguing that there aren't major problems in their models and in their work, but, have that sense, as well as Unilever, right? Who says very openly that their purpose driven brands are growing 2/3 faster than any of the other brands, right? And they're really trying to figure that out. So anyway, that spectrum of impact is kind of what we move along through the course of the summer, really trying to help you get a more nuanced understanding of where purpose is to be found and what your best next step might be, depending on all those things that Alex mentioned of, and Joe of scale, or Alex of stock, or, there are very real other considerations that you want to think about. So that's my little side note teaching moment. So you alluded to some of this, but I'm going to use another IC habit or culture piece that we do sometimes, which is a rose and a thorn. So some of you might have played this in a variety of settings, right? But give us a rose, something beautiful and delightfully smelling and positive about being purpose-driven as an individual within a for-profit company. And also, of course, a thorn, because every rose has big, pointy thorns that can hurt and draw blood. So share that. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. So I think in terms of the rose, I think for me, and I think what Alex shared in terms of being part of a values-driven organization, I feel really good about the values of our organization and kind of the scale of our impact. And when we think about for me, being part of a company that is really taking on some of the biggest and most important global health challenges. So before COVID started, we were, primarily focused on the oncology space and kind of the impact that Merck has had with some of the cancers that impact a lot of us. I think being part of that and being part of an organization where you kind of feel good about the values and the impact of the patients that we're serving, I think for me, that feels really, really good. I think in terms of the thorn, for me, I think I am a little bit removed from that sort of impact. So I'm like one very kind of small piece in this, larger system of, we have 70,000 employees across the globe. So even though, I feel really good about the impact that we have on patients and a lot of our CSR programs that we run. So the scale of that impact feels really good, but kind of my individual contribution to that impact, I feel like feels a little bit small just because I'm only one very small piece in a large organization.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that's probably a similar contemplation that a lot of our alums and people out there have to think about, right? Do you want to have that, when I was in the Middle East working in refugee camps, it was like about Lubna and her youngest son who couldn't sleep and was borderline suicidal at 8 years old, and dealing with that and helping them to deal with that however they want. I ultimately left that work because I'm like, okay, there's 50,000 other refugee families presumably having the same stuff. And no matter how well we do, we're never going to serve all 50,000, much less deal with the refugee problem at a government level, right? So do you want to be kind of a smallish cog in a very powerful wheel curing cancer, or do you really thrive off that more one-on-one impact, right? And again, there's seasons to that, I think, over people's lives. And I think there's just some individual differences there, right? Different people are driven by different things, and you just have to get clear on what it is for you. Alex, share your rose and thorn with us.
Sure. Mine are somewhat similar, and I'll give you guys an anecdote that hopefully explains both at the same time. My rose, similarly to Joe, is scale and level of influence that these corporations have. So the anecdote is my team recently got past an engagement with one of the largest UN agencies at the very, very top. So the person that we're working with reports directly to the administrator of this agency. So really cool opportunity and incredible amount of influence and scale if you think about the change that is possible there. The thorn I mentioned earlier is the kind of muddy waters that happen at a values-driven company that has a foundation arm and this revenue generating side of the business that deals specifically with NGOs, and IGOs and public sector organizations go into our government public sector side of the business. There's a lot of crosshairs over who owns accounts and relationships. And in my opinion, the thorn when it comes to this particular anecdote is the categorization of work as pro bono if it happens to be for a nonprofit. So in this case, my team is being asked to work on this account, but pro bono, but I'm logging it as pro bono, but I'm being paid to do it as if it were my day job, and I'm doing the exact work that I would do for the fertilizer company that I just worked with. So it's this kind of unhealthy characterization, I think, as a company. None of you are going to send this to my boss, right? There's an unspoken rule on this call about characterizing impact work as pro bono, because it has real value. It is really valuable for us and for that UN agency, but because it's an NGO, all of a sudden we're categorizing it that way, so as not to step into some of the muddy waters with the foundation and others. So I think those kind of things come up all the time at Salesforce specifically, because there's a massive amount of employee volunteerism. It's a really, it's a huge culture of giving back, and it's highly encouraged for that to overlap with work. But I just think it somehow devalues it to call it pro bono or to think about it that way when it's the exact same skills aligned work we'd be doing on a daily basis. So I hope that makes sense, Rose and Thorn wise, but the projects are both immensely satisfying in their ability to influence, but also not characterized as our daily work yet.
Yeah. That's a great example. I think that's really vivid, right? And really kind of typical, or like, I don't think that's going to surprise anyone. And in fact, if you had asked us how it would be classified, I bet a lot of us would have guessed correctly, but really problematic. Like, it gets at exactly the nugget of like, what's so problematic, that we have this blinder, we have this insistence on good work not generating cash. And because until now we measure our companies and ourselves to a large extent only on cash, it means that good work isn't good in the sense of professional or valued or promotable or whatever else it might be, right? So it's exactly the nugget of the problem. Whereas if we considered, first of all, it sounds like possibly just longer term profitability of this client who may well ultimately pay you, that would be, but to say nothing of if we considered some of the environmental or human impact of that work in a long-term value. And, I don't know what agency, but we all know now that nature has value, right? And trees saved has economic value down the road because of carbon reabsorbed, because, lives saved has value because those lives go to create economic value, right? So if we had any kind of medium-term, more holistic accounting, there would be massive financial value, but because we're so narrowly cash financialized, it doesn't show up on the radar, right? And we've somewhat lazily, I would say, just kind of been like, well, this is the best metric we've got and it's super concrete, so we'll just stick with cash. So no, it's a super useful anecdote. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the flip side of that too is once you do monetize that work, it somehow sullies the act of it, which is also problematic in a lot of ways. And I'm curious, Joe, on your side, if that comes across in pharma, because I would imagine similarly, a lot of employees at Merck do a lot of pro bono or skills aligned impact work on the side. And as a company, Merck obviously does a lot of business aligned pro bono work. How does that distinction show up at Merck?
Yeah, totally. No, it's really similar. And I think like we have a lot of opportunities that exist that people can take advantage of. But one thing that I would say is that it's really hard for people to find the time to engage in those sorts of activities. I think, yeah, a lot of that resonates with me for sure. Because we have obviously a lot of our impact programs are very healthcare focused. Like we do have a social, like a fellowship program where people can go overseas to kind of volunteer for a nonprofit. We run like a Merck for Mothers organization, but there isn't like a strong connection between those activities and kind of the business side of the organization. So I think kind of how you're kind of describing that resonates, a lot with me.
It was a perfect example and kind of goes to my next question. But Joe, is there I'm curious to hear, has there been a moment or an experience, something that you've been part of, knowing that it's a huge machine and you're just part of it, but when you really saw profit align with purpose and you really felt like good about, whatever the business line was? You talked briefly to the kind of cancer care, but is there some specific thing you were part of that can embody that profit meeting purpose?
Yeah, totally. So I think more recently, just in the context of COVID, so I mentioned that I lead like a data transformation program within the company, and we are working with different teams that focus on data science and data and analytics across the organization. And we had a team that was looking at how we better assess and acquire rural data, which is really important to how we prove the value of our medicines and vaccines. And they were originally looking at just a very general capability. And as soon as COVID hit, that shifted our priorities quite a bit. And fast forward 2 months, and all of a sudden we had 2 COVID vaccine candidates and a therapeutic candidate that we're trying to very quickly try to understand how we can develop those and prove that they work, so we can get them quickly kind of into the hands of patients and providers. So I worked closely with that team to shift their focus for more of a generalized capability. And sorry if you hear my crazy dog barking downstairs. Hopefully you don't hear too much background noise. So we shifted that team's focus for more of a generalized capability in order to really double down on the COVID efforts. So we got like a small agile team in place to really understand how we can more rapidly get the data we need in order to prove the value of those vaccines. And I think that for me, like, yes, there is a financial opportunity within the COVID space when you think about vaccines and treatments, but think about the impact that those vaccines and treatments can have on just kind of like what we're all dealing with. So for me, it's been, and we're still kind of living it obviously day to day, and it's taking up a lot of my time these days. But it's I think it's just exciting to be part of a company that's trying to solve that really important challenge.
Yeah, 1,000%. 1,000%. Alex, anything maybe less thorny in terms of the overlap of the profit and the purpose? Tell us one of the really good ones about how you've turned innovation into impact consulting.
Sure. I'm very glad you're spending most of your time on that, Joe. That feels like what everyone wants you to be doing right now. So carry on. The examples that come to mind most immediately for me are times when we've set out deliberately to work on an impact focused project that also had a clear monetization path. So we do have a lot of products at Salesforce that, Sustainability Cloud, Philanthropy Cloud, for example, that are deliberately set up that way. I was trying to think, though, about kind of more intangible examples of some of the ways we just go about business. We started an office of ethical and humane use of technology a couple of years ago. And so that's been a big focus within the company. And it was also to try to save for-profit employees, like salespeople who are quoted on the accounts they're handed, right? They don't get to choose which accounts they work for, from having to compromise their own ethics or values in order to sell to that customer. And so we've all heard and seen news of examples when this does not go right, but it's something that as a company we're thinking a lot about and trying to, so Salesforce has done a lot of the divestments that you would think of in particular, which I think a lot of employees feel good about. But then it also, when you think about some of the accounts you're working on that have that sell guns or tobacco or any of these things that people commonly divest in, that can be challenging to try to weigh the company's the company's profit with your own values. And so Salesforce has tried to eliminate that question for a lot of people. And I know for me personally, that's been really helpful on accounts. So I think realigning profit with values is maybe how I'd rephrase the question of the way it feels for me. I think it ties back to what I was saying earlier about if you had asked me this was going to the dark side, because I fundamentally believed that the private sector was causing a lot of the problems that the social sector was cleaning up. And I don't feel like that anymore, because I feel like I'm at a company that is trying to do this with a stakeholder capitalism mindset, not a shareholder capitalism mindset. And that fundamentally doesn't feel bad even for me to work on for-profit engagements, because they're not doing harm. So we've like crossed off the first level of impact, maybe, of do no harm.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, it's cool. No, just I was thinking about just another example for me. I think something that is top of mind, I think for a lot of us right now, is diversity and inclusion. And I think another moment for me is I've been pretty heavily involved in our employee business resource groups, which has been a really nice opportunity. But we, as we think about clinical trials and kind of how that process works, one thing that we've been involved with is trying to diversify our clinical trials. So I think we've been able to think through not only like doing that because like, yes, it's the right thing to do, but also just why that makes sense in order for the impact that we can have with our medicines and vaccines, but also, I mean, from a business standpoint, just, the business impact that has as well. So just wanted to share that example.
Awesome. Thank you. No, I think that's great. And these are some of the ways, that I think it's so exciting. Like this is my goal with starting Inspiring Capital was not to churn out a bunch of like CFOs for not-for-profits. It's about people with this level of moral leadership and curiosity and courage that you're all coming in with already. And then hopefully, we're giving some framing and tools and support and accountability to as you go forward in the private sector, in the whole economy across that spectrum of impact, right? But we need really smart, good, responsible, thoughtful people working on COVID vaccines right now. I feel really, really good about that. And yeah, there's some awesome not-for-profits doing important relief work and whatever else it might be. But I do not want all of our alums rushing there to do that. I want the Joes around for that piece. So, I think the kind of serving not-for-profits or serving social enterprises with great Salesforce technology is awesome, but ultimately for you all to be doing your whole business with an ethical backbone is way more, that's where the real magic and the transformation of the economy comes. So those are great examples. Of course, you all probably knowing me, I'm going to ask about an experience to the contrary of was there a specific moment, and your thorn sort of gets at this, Alex, but for either of you, was there a moment that you feel comfortable sharing where you really had to choose the business interest over what would have been your first choice from a values or a purpose perspective?
I can start because I just finished this project. We're consultants, so we don't get to choose who we work with, just the way the account teams don't choose. And obviously, from the way we qualify accounts at a company level, we look for a path to revenue first and foremost. So I just got off a project working with a fertilizer company. My dad is a biologist, and we love animals in my house. And I Googled the fertilizer company, and within 30 seconds found the pictures of the two-headed fish in the river and was like, oh no, I can't do this. I can't do this. And at the same time, you hear about the like Silicon Valley softness. And I've experienced some of that at Salesforce of like, well, I didn't want to work on the Hormel account because I'm a vegetarian. And I'm fundamentally, I'm like, you know what, it's your job. You don't have to eat the chili, but like you can still advise them on their marketing strategy. So I kind of bought into that for this fertilizer company of like, you know what, I don't have to buy their product. I don't own a farm. So that's a relief. And maybe there's an opportunity here to influence the way that they think about two-headed fish and sustainability somewhere along, helping them think about digitizing their crop advisor experience. So going into it with that mentality is kind of how I justified it to myself, because it is my job and they have a real need and they are wonderful, really lovely people, by the way. But it was challenging for me. And especially when we got, and I heard like the word Roundup for the first time and was like, ooh, this solidly feels in the not do no harm category and is legal in the US. So, yeah, there have been a lot of moments like that where I've had to be like, you know what, this is your job and that's okay. It doesn't all have to be UN agencies. We're going to make it through, but it doesn't feel good every day. And so that was one of my most successful projects, but it definitely, I hope that they'll buy the sustainability cloud that we recommended them along with everything else, but they may not. So some days are better than others.
Well, thanks. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I can't think of like a specific decision or like a specific project that I kind of like took and like didn't feel good. I think for me, which is not going to be super surprising, but like I think the pricing, dilemma within the pharma space where, I feel I know I'm talking about all like the positives, like, yes, like we have 2 COVID vaccines and a therapeutic, and like we're trying to cure cancer, and like all of that feels really good. But when I started at Merck, I was doing financial analysis and looking at our vaccines business before COVID, going back to in 2016, looking at our vaccines business over a 10-year time period and trying to think about revenue opportunities, the investment required to develop some of our pipeline assets, and like what that meant from a business standpoint. So yes, like you think about the impact those vaccines are having and will have on people, but and obviously this is also very timely, or there's a lot of discussion in the media and in society around why are vaccines prices so high, or why are drug prices so high, and even getting very challenging questions from my family members and friends being like, WTF, like this is crazy. And here I am, like I came here because like I thought this was like good thing, and like I wanted to have an impact. And there's like, it's like many things, like much messier when you start to dive into the details around like what is actually right. And like, yes, like we're trying to please investors and like run a very profitable, sustainable company. And like we try to be, I feel really proud about us being very responsible and transparent with our prices. But like, there's still that kind of aspect of what I do that, does eat at me a little bit, being like, yes, this is awesome that I'm having an impact, but, we are, charging a decent amount of money for some of our products.
Awesome. Thanks for the real talk, y'all. So we're committed to wrap by 5. We have another webinar back to back after this. So I have 1 or 2 more questions I'd love to get to, but I don't want to cut you all off who've been here. Are there questions from students on the line? I'm going to send that YouTube link is the kind of general IC recruiting nuts and bolts process questions. So any of that, definitely refer there. And if you have questions remaining, just reach out to my team. Super easy to find our contacts through the website or just online. But are there other questions you want to hear from Alex and Joe?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Dean.
So I'm definitely looking into, like impact roles at for-profit companies is like a, potential path for me. But a hesitation that I have is just this fear that potentially, any social impact initiatives from for-profit companies are not entirely genuine. There's like a lot, maybe a lot of companies that treat it as like lip service or just for PR. So I'm wondering if either of you have had experience, you've touched a little bit on this, but like, do you feel like you're like fighting this uphill battle within your own company to like, further the importance of social impact, or just that, they like view you as like kind of an off to the side thing?
Great question. I'm going to just pause and see if there's any other questions in the audience for time so that we can quickly address multiple. I couldn't tell. Caroline, were you going to say something, or anyone else?
My question was strangely very similar to Dean's. So
Perfect. Synced already. I love it. And everybody else okay? Nothing.
I'm just super curious, what other options did you guys think about after internship at Inspiring Capital or working at Inspiring Capital?
Awesome. All right. So however you want to answer any combination of that, Alex and Joe, we only have like 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll do a lightning combo and then I'll pass to you, Joe. So Dean, I think that's a really good question. I feel similarly, but I think, I have a lot of friends who work in pure CSR roles, like explicit impact roles at nonprofits, at for-profits. And I don't think any company sets out to check boxes, right? They're not like, let's put up a fake office and say we're doing this, and all they'll do is release press releases. I think they do that by default because they're not sure how to do it well. And so that's one of the things that brought me to Salesforce, is because we had a really incredible woman who started the foundation at Salesforce, and I think was thinking about impact right in this interesting, sustainable way. And so my challenge back to you would be, why wouldn't you want to be the person in that seat actually teaching them how to think about it correctly? I don't think anybody is doing that because they don't want to do impact right. I don't think they know how. And so they rely on the proxies of employee engagement and the grants and the community, whatever, because that feels familiar to them and because that's kind of the industry norm. But I think more and more companies are super excited and passionate about hiring people who know how to do impact well and could actually change from lip service to delivery. So that's my answer to the first one. And then, Kate, to your question, the other roles I looked at were all over the place. And I don't think it's a dichotomy that you should have to choose between. I always consider job searches as this kind of unique opportunity to try on different personas. And it might be that you have multiple at once, which I think as humans, we fundamentally struggle with, of like, well, I'm either this or that. So I was applying to Salesforce, General Assembly, and Perscolis. So General Assembly, obviously for profit, but they have an impact arm. Perscolis was a nonprofit in the Bronx. Interestingly enough, by the time I started at Salesforce, I realized Salesforce funds a program that Perscolis runs with General Assembly. So I was like, oh, these things are interconnected, and I never realized. But I just tried all three and was like, you know what, let's see what sticks. Nell once gave me great advice: start backwards from what you need in terms of like money, status, a title, whatever it is that's important to you. But you don't need all the jobs, you just need one, and you'll never actually get to make that decision. So it's kind of arbitrary anyway, but it's okay to be kind of trying several different hats on. Joe?
Yeah, a few thoughts from me. So Dean, to your question, I really haven't felt like I'm fighting this uphill battle. I actually think like companies might sound like really weird, but like I feel like companies have souls and like they do have like values. And I think if you find the right company, then like I think you'll feel good about it. Like for me, I actually first learned about Merck during an ethics class in business school at Wharton, and they were talking about this case where they were deciding whether or not to develop a treatment that they knew was not going to make any money. It was for river blindness in a poor part of the world. And like they made the decision to like do it because it was the right thing to do. And we talk a lot about our values and purpose, even though we are a for-profit organization. So I feel like if you end up in the right for-profit company, then like I think you can feel really good about it. In terms of what other opportunities I was looking at, I was mainly interested in healthcare. So my wife is a nurse practitioner. I just got really, back to what I was saying earlier, I got really interested in this balance of like for-profit and impact on patients and like all of the, messiness that is within healthcare. And I still, even now, as I'm considering kind of my future career path, I would love to use my skill sets to make our healthcare system better and improve healthcare within the U.S. and elsewhere. So like I was really attracted to the healthcare space. And maybe one other bit of a random thought, but I think it came up in throughout the discussion. I feel like we've talked a lot about navigating between nonprofit and for-profit and like different career paths. Even within my current company, like I was in finance and strategy and now data. And I feel like I read this great book recently. I don't know if anyone has read Range. And I forget the author, but fantastic book. So it's called Range. If you guys, I can send you guys a link. And there's like, it's interesting because I think a lot of people historically have had this mindset that like you need to like pick your thing and like specialize and be really good at it. And basically what the book argues is that there is a ton of value in having lots of different experiences across sectors and across roles. And sometimes I'm like, man, I have this like really windy and like weird non-traditional path. But like to me, like I feel like I've grown through all the different types of organizations and types of roles. So I feel like that is really relevant for all of you here, because I think if you're here and interested in this type of opportunity, I think that's what you're probably going to experience as you go forward in your career. And just know that like that is, I think, completely okay and like totally normal to feel like a bit uncomfortable as you're navigating different options.
Really well put, Joe. Thank you, guys. Well, I'm going to cut us off a little bit cold here to get to make sure that the other webinar kicks off on time. But thank you all so much, Alex and Joe. As always, thank you so much for really thoughtful, honest, and real talk. I appreciate it. And thank you, candidates, for being here. Hopefully that was enlightening and some tastes of the IC magic, so you can decide, whether or not that makes sense to add on to your summers next summer. So everybody stay healthy, enjoy Thanksgiving and your first term, and be in touch.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.